country of Yemen is spiraling out of control.
انطلاق هذه الحملة المباركة حملة هذه الحملة المباركة التي انطلقت من المملكة العربية السعودية بمشاركة دول عربية.
What do you think the intention is? When will it be mission accomplished?
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media developments we're across this week. What to make of the story, the geopolitics, and the coverage of Yemen. One of the world's largest news organizations wants the murder of journalists treated as war crimes. And in Greece, the state-owned broadcaster that the old government put out of business prepares for a new start. Yemen is one of those countries that's been mostly off the media map. Sana'a, Aden, those are not exactly well-known datelines. But a civil war, a proxy conflict involving some powerful neighbors, does have a way of attracting attention and news coverage. When a coalition led by Saudi Arabia began bombing Yemen about 10 days ago, the justification offered was that the Houthis are a dangerous, destabilizing force ideologically linked to and materially backed by Iran. Cue the proxy war and the airstrikes that Saudi Arabia argues are necessary to restore stability. In much of the media coverage, those claims have been left largely unchallenged, whether in Arabic language outlets with ties to the Saudis or other coalition partners, or in the Western news media. Yemen is a complicated story involving internal factions and outside interests, and the challenge of covering this story is made worse by the problem of access. Traveling anywhere outside the capital, Sana'a, is all but impossible for foreign journalists. Having a captive press corps in one place when the story is happening mostly elsewhere is never a good journalistic formula. We're hearing a lot of talk, a lot of analysis about the high-stakes geopolitics being played out in the skies over Yemen, and not enough about what's happening on the ground where the bombs are landing. Our starting point this week is Sana'a. This is how news narratives are formed. Every day, the Saudi Arabian military provides a briefing on what is happening on the battlefield. Against a backdrop of flags from the coalition countries involved, Brigadier General Ahmed Asiri offers up morsels of cockpit video, purportedly showing targets destroyed. Arabic language news channels, including Al Jazeera and the Saudi-funded Al Arabiya, are taking the briefings, showing them live.
Let's take Al Arabiya channel, which has 24/7 coverage of what's going on in Yemen. In one word, I would describe it as sensational. Sensationalizing how evil the current regime is, how evil the Houthis are.
يستخدمون المدنيين دروعاً بشرية.
They keep repeating that they have strategic hits, that they're destroying weapon caches and weapon depots in Sana'a. What is missing is that these bases that are being attacked are in highly densely populated areas in the capital. I lived next to one of those that have been repeatedly attacked in the past few days. This is completely missing from the media.
The gaps in the coverage, to me, the one that's been the most obvious is the lack of any interviewing with the Houthi rebel leadership. And I think what's been missing is any sense of what are the stakes in Yemen itself. It's not just the Saudis. I think you find this pretty much everywhere in the region, except maybe in Lebanon, that the news organs inside the country are going to follow the government line.
The Saudi-owned media, obviously, like much of the Arab media, reflects its owner and reflects the country that it is based in or that it has to operate under. Al Arabiya, for example, although its coverage hasn't been particularly sectarian, yet it's simply cheerleading for the Saudi government.
صورة خاصة بصحيفة الشرق الأوسط لطيارين سعوديين يؤدون الصلاة قبيل الانطلاق لتنفيذ طلعات جوية ضمن عاصفة.
We contacted Al Arabiya with questions about the network's coverage, but failed to get a response.
Let's bring in Adel Al-Jubair.
I'm joined now by the Saudi ambassador to the United States.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
The Saudi ambassador to the U.S. has been doing the media rounds, explaining the rationale behind an attack on a sovereign country, an attack which has already been backed by Washington.
A group that is allied and supported by Iran and Hezbollah.
And the ambassador's argument that Iran represents a threat is one to which Western audiences have grown accustomed, even conditioned.
The coverage is reflecting preconceived ideas and broad categorizations that I would almost call cliches. People are saying, oh, this is a Saudi-Iranian rivalry and it's just showing up now. I don't buy that at all. This situation is parallel to how the global media and the Western media especially broadly treated Iran in the nuclear negotiations in terms of Iran is a menace, Iran is a threat, without a lot of credible evidence being presented. And I think it's one of the great failures of the media.
If you read all the coverage certainly in the American media and watched what's being done on television, I think you would see the underlying assumption or attitude that Yemen itself doesn't matter much.
A dangerous regional war with Iran.
This, by virtue of being Saudi Arabia versus Iran, it's also Arabs versus Persians and Sunni versus Shia. And I think that narrative has dominated the coverage in the press, certainly outside the region.
It's a little bit too extreme, to be honest with you. Iran's involvement or tampering within Yemen is being very exaggerated in the media. People who are not familiar with Yemen, who don't know what's going on the ground, this is the first time for him to cover Yemen. He goes online, Googles it, sees it as a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and suddenly we have a sectarian war in Yemen. What's happening on the ground in Yemen is a power struggle between different factions or groups. It is not a sectarian war.
Another broad brush characterization of Yemen used as justification for the bombing is that it's a dysfunctional country, the dreaded failed state. Houthis controlling the north, a power vacuum in the middle, with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in control of the south. This map, produced by the American Enterprise Institute, the AEI, alleges that that's the lay of the land. It exaggerates the Al-Qaeda factor, but consider what the AEI is. It's a conservative think tank, home to neocons like John Bolton and Paul Wolfowitz, two of the Bush administration's best-known cheerleaders for the Iraq War. There's even a Cheney at the AEI. Think tanks are free to draw up all the maps they like, but why would the BBC use material from such a questionable source so prominently in its coverage?
When you see some of these maps and they depict Al-Qaeda as having, control over vast provinces of the country, which is simply not true. There's a difference between being able to control a province and simply having a presence in it. Just because you have a presence in somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that people in that area even accept you, and definitely doesn't mean that you control it.
If you're hearing in the coverage of Yemen echoes of Iraq, you are not alone. In 2003, it was the Pentagon and CENTCOM doing the briefings. These days, the uniformed sound bites come out of Riyadh. Back then, it was the specter of Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, blown out of proportion in the media. Today, it's Iran and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Back then, it was Fox News and the New York Times, among many others, setting aside their journalism in favor of stenography. This time, regional media outlets are doing the same. Throw in a few familiar neocon voices and journalists who've struggled to get access to the country, and both the parallel and the narrative are complete.
My problem with the media coverage of this is that this didn't happen whimsically. It didn't happen because there's a certain gene in Arab and Muslim people that makes them behave like this. It happened because governments, including American and Israeli and British and Arab and Iranian and Turkish, these governments made decisions, and the consequences led to a wild situation with many armed groups who are sometimes your friend and sometimes your enemy at the same time. So the confusion is partly a consequence of the complexities in the region, and partly a consequence of the confusion and laziness in the minds of Western journalists.
We'll have more on the confusion surrounding Yemen later in the program, but first, on the download, our viewers weigh in on the coverage of the story.
The mainstream Western media has, right from the onset, taken a stance that this is a sectarian conflict, it is a Sunni-Shia divide. The Arab media, on the other hand, has taken a stance that this is an operation already showing signs of success. It is one that will bring about stability and democracy, but neither narratives are actually willing to discuss what the next step will be for the people after.
Other media stories on our radar this week. The head of the Associated Press has called for changes to the Geneva Convention, the rules of military conflict, to make the killing or abduction of journalists a war crime. Gary Pruitt says that extremist groups are growing more dangerous because they no longer need journalists, since those groups can now deliver their messages directly through social media.
It used to be that when media wore press emblazoned on their vests, or press or media was on the vehicle, it gave them a degree of protection. But guess what? That labeling now is more likely to make them a target.
Pruitt is proposing the creation of a new protocol to the Geneva Convention, as well as changes to the International Criminal Court, which deals with war criminals. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, more than 1,000 media workers have been killed since 1992, 61 of them during 2014. For the second time in just over a month, a Bangladeshi blogger has been murdered for his writings. Washakur Rahman was attacked March 30th in the capital Dhaka by 3 men, 2 of whom were arrested at the scene. The suspects are reported to be students at theological schools. According to police reports, they targeted Rahman for insulting religion. Rahman was an IT manager at a travel agency who mainly blogged about religion, science, and against communalism. 5 weeks ago, Bangladeshi-American atheist writer Avijit Roy was hacked to death with a machete while visiting Dhaka, a killing that provoked street protests and led to the arrest of one suspect. In Canada, the president of the country's largest media conglomerate has had to apologize for interfering in news coverage, or at least trying to. The conglomerate is Bell Media. Its president is Kevin Kroll. When the country's broadcast regulator, the CRTC, made a decision on cable TV pricing that went against Bell Media's interests, and the CRTC chairman, Jean-Pierre Blais, was interviewed on Bell's business channel, Kroll made it known internally that Blais should not appear on any other Bell News outlet. However, journalists at Bell's biggest channel, CTV, defied their boss, did the story, and included an interview with Blais. The inside story of their defiance was broken in the Globe and Mail newspaper, which is also partly owned by Bell Media. The chastened Kroll said, "I have apologized to the team directly for this mistake. Indeed, their reaction to my intrusion only heightens my appreciation of their independence, integrity, and professionalism." A little less than 2 years ago, Greece's state-owned broadcaster, ERT, was shut down. The government of the day called it an austerity measure, saying that ERT was corrupt and wasteful. But many Greeks saw it as an act of politics, not least the employees who defied the closure and kept on working without pay. The ERT occupation became a symbol in the fight against austerity, which partly explains why the newly elected Syriza coalition government, led by Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, is so determined to get the channel back on the air. Another explanation is that this new government needs friends in the media, and it expects that the rough ride that Syriza got in privately owned corporate media during the run-up to the election will continue now that it's in office. But many have criticized the new government's legislative attempt to revive ERT, saying it's too similar to previous bills that Parliament has already seen, that it fails to address previous issues. Greece has some serious financial problems, and a state broadcaster does cost money, so there is a legitimate question as to whether Syriza will be able to afford this venture and if ERT's content will be up to scratch. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now from Athens on the resurrection of ERT.
It was March 2012 and Greece had just been bailed out for the second time. It owed its lenders more than 200 billion euros. But the money came on the condition of strict austerity. Athens had to cut spending and reduce thousands of jobs in the public sector. New Democracy, the government of the day, looked at ERT, the state broadcaster, and saw a quick fix. With more than 2,500 workers and a reputation for reckless spending and cronyism, shutting it down seemed like an easy option.
So ERT had a big payroll for individuals who were hired as political favors or due to their personal relationships with members of parliament.
These colleagues had no reason to exist, either as technical staff or administrative staff, as consultants or among the journalists. The government called us sacred cows, but it was the government's own recruits who were the sacred cows.
You can see programs that were produced during the previous period of ERT
that were, excuses for paying out money, because the quality was so low and the real cost of producing them were so low that the only reason that they were produced was in order to hand out favors to friendly producers.
The quality and the quantity of the programs on offer reflected the quality of past governments, New Democracy and PASOK, that were suffocating in the way that they interfered in the schedule, delivery and selection of reports.
On June 11, 2013, staff learned from their own coverage that ERT was being shut down. But many argued that the closure wasn't just about austerity, it was political, and that the state broadcaster was editorially out of step with the majority of the news media in Greece, owned by big diversified conglomerates that did a lot of business with the government. The media outlets they owned backed the austerity. ERT sometimes questioned it, although the ratings were so low that some say the channel had no real influence on the debate. But if the government thought that the workers would go quietly, it was wrong.
The decision of the ERT workers to keep going started half an hour after the announcement of the closure. ERT was shut down following a political decision, so all we could do was stay on the front line of this fight and keep broadcasting society's voice.
But I don't think many people cared about the old ERT. Why? Because the ratings were so low. So when you say that people are supporting the state broadcaster, you have to state what do you mean exactly. Because if support means watching it, well, no, they're not watching it. And they weren't watching it before.
Nor were they watching ERT's replacement, Nerit, a skeleton state broadcaster which the pro-austerity government set up with a fraction of the budget, fraction of the staff, and a negligible journalistic impact. All the while, the ERT journalists continued their occupation of the building and were still putting out news online via a website they created called ERT Open. Nearly 5 months after first trying to shut down the channel in Athens, the government had to send in some muscle to finish the job. After the police raid and the remaining journalists were removed from this building in Athens, most Greeks would have thought that that was the end of the ERT occupation and the state broadcaster itself. They were wrong, because a little less than 500 kilometers north from here, in Thessaloniki, around 50 media workers persevered. They stayed in their ERT building, kept producing content, and put it up on ERT's open website for free.
Our reaction as free people was to stay here and continue our work for media freedom, especially at a time when the public needed it, because free speech and the voice of those in the struggle were marginalized by the corporate media outlets under the control of the oligarchs. Gradually, our struggle and that of the Greek people became one.
We went to cover as much news as possible to help express a voice that was being presented as illegitimate. For example, when riot police were hitting the striking cleaners on a daily basis just for defending their right to work, Nerit had the title, "Cleaners Move Against the Riot Police." On the same day, we were bringing the cleaners into the studio.
Το θέμα είναι ότι δεν μας δέχονται, απαξιούνε. Απαξιούν να μας δούνε.
Interviewing them and understanding a perspective of this struggle that the private channels and Nerit refused to do.
Τα ενημέρωσης και τα δημόσια δεν πήγαν ποτέ να τις προβάλλουν.
The occupied ERT channel shared an anti-austerity agenda with the then opposition, the Syriza coalition led by Alexis Tsipras. So it followed that Tsipras promised that if elected, his party would reopen the state broadcaster. On January 25th, Syriza took office and wasted no time in trying to get ERT back on the air. But it wasn't just the opposition that had a problem with Syriza's draft bill to reinstate the channel. It was the journalists as well. They said that the new government was in too much of a hurry and that the bill was a near facsimile of the legislation that brought Nerit into existence.
It is obvious that the Syrian government is in a hurry to reinstate the old dirt. They are expecting that the political situation will change and they want to have a friendly governing board in the new broadcaster.
It's political because the new ERT should have nothing to do with Nerit, under no circumstances. When someone says we should start from scratch, he should stand by his words. And politically, it has to be from scratch, because Nerit emerged from something corrupt.
To create a new bill from scratch for the relaunch of ERT, Nerit would have to shut down as well. So we'd have two organizations being liquidated. This was impossible. Nerit's cash flow would freeze. Greeks would lose the license fees they'd already paid to fund Nerit.
Ultimately, this is a story about money and politics. ERT was shut down by an austerity-minded government and is now being revived by new leaders with different ideas and a funding plan that not everyone is buying.
Right now, the proposal suggests that every household must pay €3 a month to ERT, which means that it won't have to burden the state budget. So given the country's population, ERT can expect to receive around €300 million.
Out of this budget, if they rehire 2,500 people, around 130 to 140 million will be going for the salaries and the wages. So the rest of the money is not enough to fund the high-quality program. They either have to increase the licensing fee or they will return to a kind of television that is very cheap, but is not what we expect from a state broadcaster.
Let's not forget that ERT's programs and payroll were expensive because of the political appointments over the last 30 years. At one point, we had 5,000 ERT employees. Now we're talking about half of that, which tells you that this license fee can help the state broadcaster produce decent programs.
By resurrecting ERT, Syriza will have delivered on a campaign promise. But the question in Greece is, will the new government give the state broadcaster what it needs to deliver? And if it does, at what cost?
More voices on the download now on the media story in Greece and ERT.
The question is not whether the government's plans are feasible for the re-establishment of the ERT, but whether the government is doing enough for its protection from future attempts to silence it. Let us not forget the reason why the previous government closed down the ERT was precisely because the broadcaster maintained a critical stance towards public policy, and it made visible the impact this had in society.
Finally, when doing some research for this week's program, we came across a blog post which, for any journalist interested in geopolitics, looked like pure clickbait. It was entitled The Confused Person's Guide to Understanding Yemen. It turned out that the author wasn't a Yemeni or a foreign policy specialist. The piece was written by an architect from Lebanon, Carl Sharrow. You can say this about the Lebanese: when it comes to occasionally dysfunctional countries riven by factional politics, they do have some expertise to offer. And they're familiar with media outlets oversimplifying in a banal way stories that aren't that simple. We brought in an actor to bring Mr. Sharrow's blog post to life, and we'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
What the hell is exactly happening in Yemen is now one of the most urgent geopolitical questions in the Middle East. Now, I'm not an expert on Yemen, but being Lebanese, I am an expert at not knowing what is happening in my country, which gives me a valuable insight into the situation in Yemen. Not one to shy away from difficult challenges, I have compiled this essential primer on Yemen that will help you understand its politics and prepare you for what will happen there next. Until 1990, Yemen used to be divided into two states, North Yemen and South Yemen, until leaders in both countries realized they could merge the two countries and save on stationary costs. This, however, created deep resentments. To complicate matters further, Yemen is not religiously homogeneous, which always spices things up in Middle Eastern countries.
The rebels are Shiites. The government they pushed out there was Sunni.
They are, however, Zaydi Shia, unlike the Shias of Iran, who are Twelver. But it's best to lump them all together because it simplifies things immensely. As is generally known, Yemenis consume the stimulant drug qat in huge quantities.
Qat is the essence of nature. If we don't chew, we're not alive.
What is less known is that Sunnis refer to it as Qat, while Shias refer to it as Qit. Children of mixed marriages call it Qitqat. So, what's in store for Yemen now? The absence of any political authority in a Middle Eastern country can be best understood through metaphors about the dangers of political vacuums. One can say, for example, Yemen is facing the abyss, or staring into the void, or on the precipice of disintegration.
And tonight, the country of Yemen is spiraling out of control.
These phrases, while they don't actually tell you anything, do convey an appropriate sense of impending doom. The one thing that we can be certain of now is that Yemen is at a crossroads. To sound wise suggests that the decline in the price of oil has something to do with it. But say you're not quite sure what.